Go for it.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jeffrey Geisner, founder of the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Group on Facebook and YouTube video. Today, we're doing a Obligations of Memory podcast with my friend from San Diego, Iser Flaum. And Iser wrote a terrific book called Under My Bubbe's Wings. And here's a little bit of a brief synopsis of the story. This is a true life saga of massive life disruption, harsh treatment, total loss of family, near-death escapes, and years of Nazi enslavement by the author's father and, to some degree, his mother. It is told in the first person's viewpoint of his father's voice, plunging the reader into the predicament. His mother's history is also included, but it's limited because it was a difficult topic for her to discuss. As sole survivors of their birth families, they met after liberation in the DP camp to renew family and life. A theme throughout the author's father's vivid perception that his late grandmother, Bubbe, hovers over him as a guardian angel. This accords with a vow she gave to him as a vision on the outside of his ordeals. And boy, if that really doesn't allow us some space to really get into a great story, I don't know what would. So, but before we get into the book and a little bit about your family, why don't you tell us a little bit about you? You know, your background, your occupation. You are a second gen, as I am. So please share with the audience, who is Iser?
Sure. I was born in Germany, a town called Regen. And my parents had met in a DP camp, Bad Reichenhall DP camp, and where they lived a few years, and then they moved out into a German town, and that's where I was born. But
and
shortly,
what year was that?
1948. But shortly thereafter, they were trying to migrate to the U.S., and they finally got permission and so on. We'd get the paperwork right. And they moved to the U.S. So I was I was less than 2 years old when we came to the U.S. and spent a little time in Miami, spent a little time in Chicago, but eventually settled in New Haven, Connecticut. Those were the early years of my life. So my early life was growing up in New Haven. And basically, my dad worked in construction, so he was very vulnerable to the weather, you know, very cold in the winter, miserable working, very hot and humid in the summer, also miserable working. And we had some distant cousins who had moved to California. They said, come on down, the weather's wonderful. So we went, and lo and behold, about the 4th grade, we moved to, first of all, the LA area where those cousins lived. But then my dad was looking for work, and he found a really great job down in San Diego.
What did he do here?
He was always in the building trade, and now, as my story will show, he actually learned that skill in the concentration camps.
Interesting.
He worked on structures and so on, mostly tearing them down, but he learned how they're made, you know, by doing that.
So was there a company that he worked for in San Diego?
Yes, I have to admit, I don't remember the name.
Okay.
But after a while, he worked at many places. So
I see.
You know Shelter Island?
Yes.
San Diego. Well, he was there while they were building Shelter Island. He was a foreman involved in that development.
Okay.
So, but later on, he moved on to other things.
And how old were you when you came to San Diego?
I was fourth grade.
4th grade. Okay.
4th grade. We were in LA for a very short time. As I said, he was looking for work, and he landed this really great foreman job in San Diego, and then we moved there, and that's where we stayed for a big chunk of my life thereafter. So we grew up. I grew up from the 4th grade on, and as the years went by, my dad actually became a contractor with some help from me. I actually was the guy who took the tests. You know, he wasn't so good in English and so on. So
Okay.
he knew all the knowledge, but he didn't know how to take tests and pass
Right.
exams and that kind of thing. And I worked with him over the years, especially during college days. We'd go
What
do
language are you,
projects.
what language are you speaking at home?
Well, with my parents, I spoke English,
Okay.
but between themselves, they spoke Yiddish.
Okay.
If
Do
they
you
didn't
know
want,
Yiddish? Do you know
oh
Yiddish?
yeah, I know it very well.
Okay.
When but when they didn't want the kids to understand, they would speak Polish. You know. Also, the cousins I mentioned, the distant cousins that lived in LA, they spoke German, because actually my mom, her original language is German, because she grew up in Poland, but it was Silesia, a section of Poland which was originally German. So in her home, they spoke German. So all her relatives spoke German.
So tell me a little bit about your mom. You talked a little bit about your father. So tell me more about your mom.
My mom, as I mentioned, was much more quiet about her experiences. She was very reserved and timid about it. You could see it was painful for her to talk about it. So I only was able to capture a much smaller
But
portion of her.
did your mom stay home? Did she?
Yes, she was a stay-at-home mom. She raised the kids, and that's basically it.
And how many brothers and sisters do you have?
I had a sister, unfortunately, a few years ago, due to health issues, she passed away.
My condolences.
Yeah. So that's it. I grew up and I went to San Diego State, the university, which was very close to where we lived. I could actually take my bike sometimes. Eventually, of course, I drove there. So that's where I got my degree in physics. And then I got a stipend to do graduate work at Duke University.
Mhm.
So I schlepped over to North Carolina,
Right.
and I was able to study over there, and they paid my tuition, and they paid for my living expenses because I was a TA, teaching assistant, and I got my master's in physics. Now, I always liked the field of electronics. So even though I studied the theoretical stuff, I was also always interested in applied things. So after I got my master's in physics, I came back to San Diego and stayed with my parents a while. And I got an offer at Navy Electronics Lab for an engineer. And the guy, my boss even said, I know you didn't study electronics, but I like having a guy under me who's got a master's. So that's where it started. So I actually learned a lot of practical electronic things at work.
So when did you get that job? What year are we now?
That would be okay. Well, let's see. I graduated. I got my master's in '72. So probably about the end of '72 is when I started working in the electronics field.
And you were working for the Navy?
I started, Navy Electronics Lab down in Point Loma.
Yep.
It had a beautiful cafeteria up on the second floor. You could see the whole bay and the city of San Diego in the background. And that's when I learned that the civil service jobs are quite comfortable. 2-hour lunch breaks in the morning, 2-hour coffee break in the afternoon, that kind of thing, schmoozing in the cafeteria and overlooking all the battleships and the bay and San Diego.
And our listeners really don't have an understanding how beautiful that is.
Oh, it's, yeah.
They often say that coming to San Diego, we live here, but people come here for their vacation all year around, and we don't appreciate what we have in front of us every day.
Yeah, it's picture postcard view, of the whole downtown San Diego and the bay and Coronado Island across the water, and it was great. But I wanted to move on. I wanted to do more design things and so on. So I sent my resume out, and so I landed a job in the northern LA area, and I got more heavily into design because I wanted to be designing stuff. I wanted to be creating new things. And so I did. I got into that. And
what company did you work for in North?
That was I worked for many companies, so it's hard for me to remember all the details, but at the moment it slips my mind.
Okay.
But it was an aerospace company, and I worked on mine hunting sonars and things of that type. And I did design work, and that's when I was living in LA, and I started looking around for female companionship. That's when I met my wife in LA, and then we got married. And the first thing she said is, "How much do you make?" I told her. She said, "Update your resume." So I updated my resume and started moving around. And when you move around, you go up in salary too. So
Right. Yeah.
and you get new experiences. So actually for a lot of my career, I was actually a consultant. So I didn't even become an employee. I hopped around doing little projects. When that was done, I would move to another project. So if you look at my resume,
what would you
right,
say is your expertise as a career?
digital electronic design, both hardware and software.
Okay.
So if you look at my resume, it's like a who's who of aerospace and high-tech companies in Southern California. And I did commercial things. I worked on some of the stuff I was most proud of is worked on ultrasound equipment, like when you go to the doctor and they scan you and check what's inside of you. I worked for Philips Ultrasound. They may actually be using equipment, some of which I contributed some of the technology to.
Very interesting.
So that was a very, very satisfying career.
Okay, so when did you retire?
I retired, I would say about 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago.
Okay.
And that was it. And also that's when I started getting interest in, because I had time on my hands, and I started remembering, my parents had already passed, but I started remembering kind of a buried obligation to tell their story.
Well, that's a great segue. So let's start there. But I want to go all the way back to where your father grew up and his family customs, whatever you know. Same thing with your mother. So let's start there before we get into the heaviness of the camps and the work that he was doing. I want to hear about the customs that your parents may have talked to you about growing up where they had. So your father in Germany, your mother in Poland.
No, my father, both in Poland.
Both in Poland. Okay.
Both in Poland, but my mother was in Silesia, which is a German-speaking part of Poland. Actually, the Poles took it from the Germans in World War I.
I see.
Okay, so at home they spoke German. My mom, my dad, they spoke Yiddish, but also Polish in the streets. And so my father's family was religious, very religious. They went Shabbos, every Shabbos they would go to synagogue, and he was one of 8 kids, so they had a huge family. And his mother was his mother was more religious than his father, and she made all the boys put on tefillin every morning. They had the daven, and they had to, when they came for breakfast, they had the vow that they put on their tefillin, and once in a while they had to vouch for each other in case one cheated, to tell her that, yeah, he put on his tefillin, you know. So they were religious that way. They were not Hasidic, but they were, let's say, Orthodox. Okay, so and his father, believe it or not, did a job that it's not usually typical for Jews in those days in Poland, but he was actually a weaver. His father was a weaver by trade, but he knew he had connections, and he had connections with a wealthy Jewish guy in a town called Dobrzin nad Rewens. And the guy owned a huge ranch out in the fields outside of town. And he hired my father's father to be the foreman of that ranch. He had hundreds of horses, maybe thousands of cows, and a whole little village of Poles that worked there. And my father was put in charge. My father's father, my grandfather, who was the same name as me, Iser Flaum, and he was in charge of that. So my dad grew up in that farm environment. In fact, he said every day when he was a baby, they would bathe him in milk.
Huh.
They had milk coming out their ears, So they would just bathe.
So what kind of education did your father have? What kind of career did?
Well, he after a few years, that farm was sold to a non-Jew who basically got rid of my father's father. And so they went to the town, that little town nearby, Dobzhin, another events. And then things were getting tough because they didn't really have a good trade and a good business. And they kind of lived by the generosity of a baker's family, which was very dear to them. They lived upstairs above a bakery. And in the beginning, my grandfather had a couple of horses. He would, and a wagon, and he would do deliveries and that kind of thing. But then the horses got sick and they died, and they were living hand to mouth, basically. It was kind of a difficult living. And two of my father's brothers, the older ones, were working as down in the bakery, learning the trade.
Right. So you're eight brothers and a very difficult.
8 brothers and sisters. 8 brothers and sisters.
Yeah, and a lot of people to feed.
Yeah, a lot of people to feed. And in fact, that was a part of the problem, the difficulties. They would have to eat lean most of the week. But as I said, they were religious, so they saved up for Shabbos. Friday night was a banquet. Every Friday night, no matter what, they saved during the week, and they had a banquet for Shabbos. And the baker down below always sent up a servant with a beautiful challah for them. So they had a nice challah every Shabbos.
Now these are memories your father was sharing with you, right?
Yes, my father told me all of his stories since I was a little kid. He would tell me all of his stories, sometimes over and over again, until it became just part of my memory.
Right.
My mom told me a few things, but as I said, not too much. So I know my father's.
What about your mother's? What about your mother's memories of her growing up?
Yes, she, as I said, she was living in a German area, and her parents owned a tavern. They were so they ran a tavern, and it catered mostly to Polish miners. It was an area where there were mines, and they would come up. They'd want to have their schnapps or whatever in the evening, and they catered to those people, and they would interact with those people and be friendly with those people. And she was in a town called Świętochłowicz. I think the name has changed over the years, but that's what it was then. And as I said, it was a German-speaking area. And she remembers the tavern and her parents interacting with the clients and so on. And now she was not quite so religious. She would, I would say, you would probably classify as like conservative. They were identifying Jewish. They would do the major holidays, but it wasn't like a daily thing. And then the parents would send her to Hebrew school. They had to go to a nearby town. They didn't have one in her town. So they would send her to a nearby town for Hebrew school to learn her background. And so both of them were in their late teens when the war broke out. And
what year in 1939?
39, yeah. So my dad was 17. My mom was probably like 15, 16. And when the Nazis came in. And immediately they started rounding up young men and young women also to do grunt work for them. So, in fact, in the beginning, when the war first started, it wasn't like concentration camps and formal places that they punished people and so on. It was more or less just kind of conscripting people off the street. They needed people to do this job, or they needed them to do that kind of job. they would grab you off the street. And in fact, the first thing that happened is my dad, his father, and one or two older brothers were grabbed off the street, and they were put to work tearing down a Hasidic campus. The Gera Rebbe was a well-known Hasidic movement, and they had a whole campus of buildings and so on. And my dad and his gang were forced to start tearing it down.
Now, were they
That's where-
were they already
No,
wearing
they had
scars?
moved. Okay, I didn't mention, they moved out of the town I originally mentioned because his parents actually came from Alexandrov near Lodz. It's a suburb of Lodz.
Mhm.
That's where they originally came from. And they decided things are getting bad. There were rumors war was going to come. They said, let's go over there. It's a bigger location. It's not a little town. It's more people. We might be safer. Plus, they got relatives over there. So they said, let's go over there. So they sent my dad ahead of time. My dad was kind of the go-getter of the family. He was only 17, but whenever they needed something done, they would trust my dad and send him because he always did things. He was conscientious and he was creative and resourceful. So they sent him ahead to the town,
And
Alexandro,
this is Lodz or the
near Lodz. Yeah,
near Lodz. Okay.
yeah, Alexandro. And so he befriended somebody, or no, it was actually a relative who was in the shoemaking business. And he took my dad and helped, brought him in. And they actually started a little business because everybody was panicking. They're worried that the Germans are going to come. And people started worrying, what am I going to do? How am I going to hide my gold coins and things like that? So my dad and this guy came up with a business of they would modify people's shoes.
No kidding.
And they would open up the heel and make a little hiding area in the heel. So you could put coins and other valuables, jewelry, and then you would close it up and nobody knew you had it. They could search you. And of course, eventually they figured it out, but there was a big business for a while of making these modifications to shoes. And my dad was making good money. So he called the rest of the family over. He said, come on over to this town. And they moved also there. And so they lived there for a few months. And
now, can I ask you?
Go ahead.
Your title is Under My Bubby's Wing. Is the Bubbe your father's mother?
Yes, it was my father's mommy,
Okay.
or mom.
Your grandmother.
No, my grandmother and father are my dad's parents. This is the grandmother of my father. So it's my great grandmother.
Okay, your great grandmother.
But remember, I told the story, I didn't mention yet. I tell the story from my dad's first person.
Yes.
So it's as if he's telling the story. Right. So when he says my Bubba's wings, it means it's my father's Bubbe.
Yep.
So he was her most beloved grandchild. She loved him dearly, and when he was little, she lived with them, and he would always help her. She would always cook his favorite meal, lakshan with yoach, chicken noodle soup, which he loved. And then she died about 7 years before the war, but he always remembered her with love. And so after another ordeal, I already talked about this short job where they were tearing down buildings. But then later on, he was actually conscripted and sent to Plotzov near the Polish truce line with the Russians. Because you remember in the beginning, Germany made a truce with Russia. They said, we'll take half of Poland, you take the other half, we'll share it. And so the Russians came in and they took the eastern half of Poland. And at that boundary, they didn't trust each other. So the Germans were building a huge anti-tank trench. It went miles and miles. They needed grunt workers to do the digging. So they conscripted out of this little, I didn't mention before that, they took my parents, my dad and his family, and they marched them to a little town called Bolimov. And that town became a ghetto where they fenced it off. The Jews came in and they lived with the Jews that were already there. The non-Jewish people were basically kicked out.
Right.
It became a ghetto. Jews had to live there, were living there, constrained. And my dad said he remembers they having to beg for food from the people around them.
And this is
And
still,
even
this is when, still 1939 or?
yes, 1939, on the end, at the north, towards the end of 39. And then while he was in that town, a lot of people started getting typhoid fever, unsanitary conditions, lice all over the place. People started getting this typhoid, and this was before the big concentration camps and everything like that. So it was more like still an occupation kind of environment. So the Germans actually set up a clinic for the people with the typhoid. Of course, they didn't want to get sick either, so they wanted to try to control it. So they set up a clinic, put a Jewish doctor there, and he needed nurses. He needed people to assist him. So they just conscripted a bunch of young people in the ghetto, including my dad, to be like nurses or doctor's aides. So he went to that clinic, and and the doctor loved him. Again, he was very creative and very resourceful. So he put him in charge of the other nurses, and he got some experience helping people that were sick and so on. And he actually got typhoid the first time in that environment, but he got through it and he survived that. But then as time went on, they conscripted him again. This time they sent him to that town I told you, Platsov, near the Russian truce line, to go dig the trench. So they took about 40 or 50 young people out of that town, Bolimov, and sent them over there. So my dad went with all these guys, and he said horrible living conditions. Basically, everybody stuffed into an empty house. Some of them had to climb the attics. It's the only place they had to sleep, in the attic. And then they'd work like horses, digging this big trench. It was an anti-tank trench. And that's the picture on the cover of my book.
Do you have
showing
a book?
that.
Do you have your book? Do you have your book handy?
Yes.
So why don't you show the picture
Yeah.
so we can see it? And those of you who are listening, obviously, Under My Bubbe's Wings is available on Amazon, and you certainly can find the book. It's a terrific book. And this is a great place for us to realize we've just finished our first episode, Iser. So we're going to take a break here, and we're going to come back on the other side, and we'll hear more about Iser's family and how this book came to be and the power of the book. So stay with us for our episode number 2.